he will make a serious introduction into our debate so that other keynote speakers prepare better. I'll have no special word of introduction. I was invited 1.5 weeks ago to take part in the forum. This is why I'll have several ideas on the interim government. I will speak in English. Please forgive me for that unfriendly behavior.
Provisional government. There are two narratives of the provisional government. The first moves from the founding of LAFAS in Berlin to the uprising and the provisional government, which is considered to be a Nazi collaborator, and ends with the killing of the Jews with the complicity of the government. A short, brief episode in which anti-Semitism played a central role. The other narrative treats the uprising and the provincial government as the beginning of resistance to Soviet rule that lasted, depending on an individual's point of view, until the end of the partisan resistance in the early 1950s, or until the recovery of Lithuanian independence 20 years ago. In this narrative, the provisional government disbanded itself, passive resistance organizations were organized, the Nazi effort to form the Waffen-SS formation in March 1943 failed, the Vietnam Dinktine was oversubscribed to in 1944, the return of the Soviet occupiers met with sullen silence and open partisan resistance, encouraged by the hope of Western intervention. I think an important document is that, for example, telling the mood of the country, in 1945, the Lithuanian Communist Party, in the hope of commemorating the 5th anniversary of Lithuania's incorporation into the Soviet Union, decided to send a letter of thanks to Stalin, signed by as many Lithuanians as possible. The party and security services made a heroic effort to collect the signatures, but the whole process ended in dismal failure. In a report to higher authorities, the head of state security noted that students in Vilnius refused to sign, saying that if such a letter were sent, the world would believe that Lithuania supports the Soviets and all hopes for independence would be buried. In another report sent to Beria himself by the head of the KGB in Lithuania, it mentioned that in the Damygala of 250 people, of 8,000 people, only 250 signed. In the village of Vyžuonė, where the local activists blocked the exit with the table, the people escaped through the windows without signing. Again, the reports of the boycott here are written by Soviet officials, not by partisans or pro-Western sympathizers. The narratives, this narrative, or at least parts of it, are not just a local product. In his civil wars in the Soviet Union, the historian Alfred Reber notes the uprising against the Soviets. He claims that Latvians and Estonians collaborated more fully with the Germans than the Lithuanians. Quoting, of the three Baltic peoples, the Lithuanians continue to display the highest level of political consciousness and organization, as evidenced by the broad nature of the partisan movement. Now the question is, if it was the beginning of the resistance, was it then could there be a story about the resistance if the provisional government was a government of collaborators? So the question is, was the provisional government a Nazi collaborator or a puppet regime? Let's invoke the Quine's famous dictum, no entity without identity. No entity without identity, which can be roughly parsed as the assertion that only entities for which we have a criterion of identity are real entities. To answer the question whether the provisional government collaborated with the Germans, it might be worthwhile to look a little bit more closely at what collaboration is. First of all, collaboration is a relatively recent phenomenon. And again, it has several features. First of all, it requires the equivalent of a modern national state, where the loyalty of co-nationals is expected and demanded. No one cared or even asked peasants what they thought. No commitment was demanded, and interestingly, even in World War I, collaboration was not a major concern. A second factor is that you need a longer-term occupation of a larger territory that is not part of an immediate fighting zone, because in the fighting zone, the army and its commands are sovereign. And a third feature noted by Jan Gross is that collaboration is occupier-driven. That is, the occupying power must ask for collaborators to step up to the plate. If not requested, collaboration is not possible, or it's only at the level that's determined by the occupier, and if offered, it is almost invariably accepted. There are also three types of collaboration. Collaboration of state, where the conservative elite tries to save what they can of the state structure. You have collaborators of sympathy, of ideology, who perhaps join in seeking a new order and are ideologically committed. And the third group is probably opportunists. Opportunists, not ideologues, but realists seeking accommodation and personal benefit in the new circumstances. Concerning the first condition, there is the expectation of the loyalty of the population to state and nation. Collaboration is a betrayal of that loyalty by giving services to an occupier or cooperating with enemy forces against one's country. It is a crime against the nation or the state. In post-war France, those charged with collaboration at lower levels could resort to various justifications, excuses, legal defenses. Some are fairly standard. For example, lesser evil. If I had not done X, regime hardliners would have done it in would have done even more and have performed it in a harsher fashion. There is a double game argument. I joined the regime to learn what it was doing and to thwart its plans. Third, you have standard counterfactuals. If I had refused to do X, I would have been severely punished. But most important is the claim, at times accepted by the courts, that an act that by itself would trigger guilt and sentencing may be partially or wholly offset by the performance of some other act. In collaboration cases, small services done to the resistance could offset heavy involvement, say, in the repressive apparatus of Vichy, and even when it was evident that the service was being offered to avoid possible subsequent punishment. Again, this situation is quite unique. An admitted arsonist would not get a reduced sentence by showing that on other occasions he had helped put out fires started by others, or a thief, if he provided, would not be as exonerated if he proved that he donated some of the money to charities. In a certain sense, the individual during a certain time span is being judged with the possibility that positive actions can redeem negative ones. The second condition, that the site, so to speak, of collaboration is a longer-term occupation of a larger territory, raises the question of timing and duration. Even the occupation of a country can, at the initial moment, be disguised or its implications muddled. For example, that of Lithuania in 1940, because no armed resistance was offered to the occupying Red Army. Paleckis, for example, is considered a traitor and a collaborator from day one, while others are excused if they distance themselves from the Soviets after Moscow's intentions had become clearer. Kreva Mickevičius is a good example. Poor political judgment and a desire to ingratiate oneself can be excused, particularly if you plead ignorance. When did the French, Belgians, or Danes serving in their country's administration begin to collaborate? The situation in Denmark is interesting. After the war, there was a discussion on timing. Danish civil servants wanted more rigorous criteria to apply for collaboration after the 29th of August, 1943, when the Germans assumed direct rule over the country, then for the first, say, 3 years of the war. The resistance lawyers wanted equal rigor to be applied for the whole period of occupation, claiming that it would be wrong to absolve, quote unquote, translating from Danish, the largest and most dangerous group of traitors, those who were astute enough to leave the sinking ship on August 29th. In the end, the resistance lawyers got their way, with some exceptions. The collaboration was primarily for reasons of state, especially in the early stages of the war when German victory seemed inevitable. The administrators believed that they would rule the country more gently and rationally and make the German presence less oppressive and ponderous. It is noteworthy that in Denmark, within weeks of occupation, German forces were reduced to less than 10,000 men. And the ratio of German to local administrators in Denmark was 1 to 43,000. And this is in the country that saved the most Jews. At the beginning, it was the most cooperative. In France, you had a proportion of 1 German administrator to 15,000 French. In Norway, 1 to 3,700. In the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, 1 to 800. While in Poland, it was a ratio of 1 to 4, 1 to 6. And that's not counting the SS and the 500,000 soldiers who were stationed there. Jan Garros writes that collaboration must have the explicit consent of the occupier. It emerges at the intersection of the occupier's intent and the occupied's perception of a range of actions available. Nazi intent was never clear, except for the killing of the Jews and the crushing of Bolshevism, so could never be satisfied efficiently, while implementation of policies was complicated by the turf wars among the various agencies of the Nazi polyarchy, the army, the SS, the civil administration, Goering's 5-year plan, and economic empire, and other such entities. Who, if anyone, invited the provisional government to cooperate, and what conditions were offered? Let's take a quick glance at other countries. Less than 4 days after the invasion of Yugoslavia, the Germans fetched Ante Pavelic from Italy to head the so-called independent state of Croatia, which was formerly a monarchy and an Italian protectorate. It was given full recognition by the Axis powers and by countries under Axis occupation, as well as Franco Spain. The government had freedom of action. Slovakia gained autonomy after the Munich Agreement, and on the 13th of March 1939, after the central government sent troops to Bratislava and had deposed the Prime Minister Tiso, Hitler invited Tiso to Berlin and urged him to proclaim Slovakia's independence, making it clear that if Tiso did not consent, Slovakia would be left to the tender mercies of Hungary. After momentary hesitation, Tiso chose independence, which was announced the following day, while on the day after, Slovakia asked for German protection. Slovakia was recognized by Axis allies, but also by Switzerland, the Vatican, and I believe Estonia and Lithuania. Lithuania still being ruled by Smetona. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me. Now, the Lithuanian government, the provisional government, primarily had ties with the Wehrmacht, but also with various intermediaries of the SS. Heinz Gref of the SD, who, while not completely insignificant, is not mentioned even once in Peter Longerig's 1,000-page biography of Himmler, and Peter Kleist of Ribbentrop's bureau at a time when Ribbentrop had fallen out of favor and was relegated to the background. Although the lack of contact should have been a clear signal of Nazi intentions, excessive faith was placed in the Wehrmacht as being more powerful and benevolent than it actually was, and that may have played a mollifying role. But even the army officials made clear that political decisions were in Hitler's hands and would not be forthcoming until the end of the war. To what degree did the provisional government fit the collaborationist framework? How does it compare with other such regimes? It is to some degree sui generis. Lithuania was the only country that organized such an uprising and claimed the establishment or re-establishment of its independence. Nowhere else did this occur. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists declared the establishment of a Ukrainian state in Lviv on the 30th of June, but the state had not existed before, so had neither clear boundaries nor personnel. Again, you could be very difficult to call the provisional government a puppet regime if a puppet regime is one that in reality is an organ of another state who has propelled a trusted ally within the target nation into power. Slovakia and Croatia could be classified as puppet states. In contrast, Skirpa was placed under house arrest and not allowed to return to Lithuania because of his insistence on Lithuanian independence. Plans to install General Raštikis failed because of his refusal. Greife, for example, made quite clear that the Germans would not, and this was, I think, in the first week of July, would not recognize the provisional government and ordered it to transform itself into an advisory council, the Vertrauensrat. The provisional government rejected the German arguments. So in that sense, the Germans did not empower the provisional government, did not acknowledge or formally recognize it. So this is not the sort of standard way that puppet masters and puppet regimes act toward one another. Again, the uprising and its activity were directed not against its own state, but against an occupier, and especially cruel one at that. Again, the contrast with Paleckis and the communists is rather clear. They were in the business of burying the Lithuanian state. The uprising hoped, naively perhaps, to resurrect it. One of the first steps of the government, one of the very few first steps of the government, was the attempt to restore the state as it was before the Soviet occupation by asking all government officials to return to their post. It did not try to place known German agents in positions of influence that they had not held before. If they had held such positions before, they probably took them back, although some were appointed. And again, the contrast is relatively clear. The government the Paleckis government, for example, actively purged Lithuanian officials to make room for party and Kremlin loyalists. The results of this policy were double-edged. It assured that government posts were filled, but also created the structures that could be and were used by the Germans. For example, the call for Lithuanian officers and soldiers to return to the ranks of what was to be an independent force, fighting with the Germans, but for Lithuanian independence, gave the Germans a pool of trained men, reorganized into police battalions that played an active role in the killing of Jews, not just in Lithuania, but also outside its borders. The reconstituted municipal authorities followed orders to round up the Jews for their execution. There is the horrific entry in the diary of Zenonas Blinas, written on the 14th of September, where he writes that he had been told by the authorities in the district of Rokiškis that 9,000 Jews were to be killed, and he went on to describe quite accurately the procedures that were used in the open-air massacres. Nazi sympathizers assumed leading posts in the security police. I think more research, I'm not all that up to date, but I believe that more research is needed into the personnel policy of the provisional government, how leading military and police officers were appointed, to what degree do they report to the provisional government, to what degree the provisional government monitored or tried to influence their work. Again, if collaboration is cooperation with enemy forces against one's own country, then even if the provisional government cooperated with the Germans, it did not do so against its own country, but against the occupier against the occupier. The restoration of Lithuanian independence, or as much of it as possible, was the goal of the uprising, and that cannot be easily construed as betrayal of state and nation. So I think summarizing in a very rough fashion, the provisional government was not placed in power by the Germans, assumed its role to some degree against German wishes. It was not a puppet regime blessed, in part organized and officially recognized by the occupier, and in rising against the Soviets, it did not rise against its own state, but sought to reestablish the status quo ante before the occupation of the 15th of June, 1940. That said, the question arises why the provisional government did not resign or publicly protest when it became aware of the fact that independence was unlikely to be granted and that German policies were far more vicious than they could have foreseen. First of all, I think there was hope for the Slovak solution. If not independence, then at least a certain kind of protectorate status, which could function as a firewall to retain some freedom of action in internal affairs. Again, Slovakia did have this freedom of action. The Nazis negotiated with Tiso for the deportation of Jews from Slovakia to Auschwitz. They did not just send in Einsatz commandos or OPO units to do this, and there was a temporary halt to the deportation of the remaining 24,000 in the autumn of 1942 when Tiso and the Slovak government insisted on it. There was the memory of 1918 when independence was gained to some degree under German auspices. There was also the bitter experience of the past year, the experience that neutrality was not the answer. Under Smetona, Lithuania stayed neutral, defied German pressure to join the war against Poland and retake Vilnius and its regions. But Lithuania was occupied and suffered. Again, there was also, I think, the argument of the lesser evil. After the Soviets, anything seemed better, not just to many Lithuanians, but also to Latvians and Estonians. One can perhaps make the claim that by their participation in the Holocaust, Latvians and Lithuanians tied their fates to the Germans. The argument is much more difficult to make in the case of the Estonians. There were only 5,000 Jews in Estonia. Most managed to escape to Russia before the Germans marched sufficiently north to capture them. The 1,000 that were captured were killed, although many Estonians are said to have interceded with the Germans in an effort to save them. I think the aversion to the Soviets is insufficiently appreciated in the West. Many Estonians served in German auxiliaries, later in the Estonian Waffen-SS. In March 1943, a partial mobilization was carried out in Estonia, during which 12,000 men were called into service. In January 1944, 38,000 volunteers jammed registration centers after a call for mobilization. And this was after Stalingrad, after Kursk, when it seemed quite clearly that the Germans were, if not on the way to defeat, at least they were in major trouble. You had a similar, and it is generally claimed that that Estonia had the greatest percentage of foreign volunteers in the German army. 60,000 out of a population of 1.2 million. Others estimate that the number of Estonian volunteers was even larger. Even in Latvia itself, you too again are talking about between 60 and 80,000 with various kinds of differences. Okay, that said, it has to be stated that the Vertrauensrat that replaced the provisional government and was headed by Kobilūnas was clearly a collaborationist entity. The same could be said for the mobile police battalions, the security police, and some members of the local government. Again, the question is, once again about the provisional government. It was kept at arm's length, but did it deceive itself? How much did it deceive itself about German intentions, putting an excessively optimistic gloss on German plans for Lithuania's future? In its memorandum to Rendell on its resignation, it wrote, and again, the assumption is, I'll read the quotation in Lithuania, this document comes from Škirpas's book. Landsbergis has also cited it, and there is also always the possibility that it was edited. I mean, I don't know if anyone has an original copy of it, but it goes, the penultimate paragraphs are, we believe
that remembering the permanent friendship of the Lithuanian nation, the heads of the German Reich will recognize the further future of Lithuania. Being clear about the future, Lithuania will wait for acknowledgement and recognition. Lithuania is ready to cooperate with the great German Reich in their quest for the freedom of nations and combat of Bolsheviks and in creation of a new structure in Europe. The cause of independence is underlined, but in cooperation with Germany.
Wash its hands too quickly from the fate of its Lithuanian Jewish citizens accepting the German insistence that Germans and only the Germans will decide Jewish policy. I think it's quite clear that the provisional government should have protested against German policy, but I find it hard to envisage how they could have done this other than by resigning. But by resigning, they would be handing over power, what little there was of it, to the Voldemarininkai and other radicals who were more than eager to please the Nazis. This is the standard form of self-justification, namely, if I resign or I am replaced, my place would be taken by a hardliner who would do greater damage. This is an argument that is usually greeted with a great degree of skepticism, and rightly so. On the other hand, simply to wash your hands of the whole matter, to return, so to speak, to tilling your own garden, is perhaps not the most responsible decision. I think it is fair to say that many or most Lithuanians supported the provisional government, that the provisional government consulted with appropriate experts in drafting legislation and did so independently of the Germans, but this does not preclude the possibility that the legislation was not wise, that it was ill-advised, or even that it was ill-willed. And the question of legislation the question of legislation returns us to the vexed question of the power of the provisional government. To what degree did it govern? On the one hand, it is said that it was ignored and powerless. It was ignored and isolated by the Germans, so powerless to intervene in behalf of the Jews. On the other hand, Soviet structures were dismantled, the old regime was constituted as much as possible, the Postal Service even managed to issue special stamps. Perhaps influence and impotence were intertwined. Again, this calls for a lot more research than is out there. And since we're talking about memory, there are two things, just a final passing thing. A lot that even the best of scholars, when they write about Lithuania, they exaggerate in one direction or in the other. In his fine book, Bloodlands, Timothy Schneider mentions the fact, makes the claim that Škirpa on Kaunas radio urged the Lithuanians to kill the Jews. It's not that just the fact that in this respect, Schneider was misinformed, although he's one of the best historians around. Not only was he misinformed, but also all of his friends who read the book didn't notice the error, and it wasn't noticed by its publisher, which I think was by the publishing staff, I think, of Oxford University Press. On the other hand, you have, I mentioned Reber. Reber comes out with the claim that there were 100,000 Lithuanian partisans in the uprising, while I think that the figures are probably not much more than 10 or 15,000. Blandišauskas has done the most work on it. And for example, in the Unknown Eastern Front, a translation of his An der Seite der Wehrmacht, Rolf Dieter Müller, a leading German historian, makes huge mistakes. For example, he writes that in June of 1940, 21,000 members of former Lithuanian army elite troops were deported to Siberia. And also that the uprising mobilized about 10,000 armed fighters, about 4,000 of whom lost their lives. Again, exaggerations. Ačiū.
Thank you.
Ačiū pranešėjui. Na, iš tikrųjų,
Thank you so much indeed. The collaboration of the puppet of the provisional government is one of the most sensitive issues in today's historical culture, one of the wounds, and I have no doubt that after this presentation, this wound has been moved. Probably it has excited a number of questions. However, time flies, and I believe we can limit ourselves to just a few questions, if you have any. Well, I would have a question. Well, first of all, I would like to thank my friend Kęstutis for the most comprehensive presentation, for his courage to enter such deep jungle. And at the same time, I would have the following question. The first idea of Sąjūdis, when trying to reestablish Lithuania's independence after March 1990, based by signatories. The goal was also to reestablish Constitution of 1938. And it was before the current Constitution was adopted. The question is, when speaking about the provisional government, whether it understood all the conditions with the presence of Nazi of reestablishment of independent state. And by choosing the bad alternative of the two, whether the re-establishment of the Constitution of 1931 is supposed to be the first act of this government. If among the categories you have mentioned the collaboration and the collaborative regimes that existed in Europe, perhaps Kaunas ghetto establishment plan could be adopted as well. That was going on. The constitution that had a concept of defending all the citizens of the republic, if that was an attempt to reestablish the Republic of Lithuania, where did the attempt to reestablish the Constitution of 1938 disappeared? We understand it was unreal in view of the situation, of the then situation. But anyway, why was it only an attempt related to one category of citizens? I don't have a more detailed answer to this question. Why wasn't that the first step? I wouldn't be able to answer this because I haven't been researching into this issue. It's a very good remark anyway, and I don't know whether anyone has done any major research on this issue. Well, you mentioned that collaborant is the one that joins efforts with his enemy and goes against his own country. What about several hundred of thousands of people? Wasn't they a part of our country? Of course they were a part of our country. That's a fact. If we didn't have Jewish genocide, we wouldn't have had all the complications and the debate regarding the provisional government and its role. And as I have mentioned, this is one of the facts that the provisional government have adopted this act. As far as the provisions regarding Jews are concerned, we still have the same question: under what circumstances that was made? But it's a good observation anyway. Thank you so much for the